Can a narcissist actually change? Or are you just holding on to hope that keeps you stuck? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, you're going to hear another clip from an interview I did with Valerie Greene on her podcast, Soul Shaking Love. In this clip, we dive into two more of the most common and important questions people ask when it comes to narcissistic relationships. 1, can a narcissist actually change? And 2, how do you know if it's even possible to change? This clip gets into what meaningful change would actually look like, beyond the surface level gestures that often keep people hanging on. There are 4 key factors that really determine whether someone on the narcissistic spectrum can truly grow. I wanted to briefly outline them here because in the conversation, Valerie and I were moving through them in a more fluid, less structured way, so they may not have come through as clearly as I'd like. 1, their ability to acknowledge the problem, meaning they can take responsibility for their behavior without deflecting, justifying, or externalizing blame. 2, their capacity for emotional depth, which basically means the ability to tolerate painful feelings like shame, vulnerability, and grief, rather than shutting down or returning to fantasy or idealization. 3, their willingness to engage in meaningful self-reflection. What we're getting at here is a sustained effort to look inward, confront maladaptive defenses, and remain committed over time to emotional growth, because change does take time when there's a personality disorder involved. And finally, 4, their ability to form genuine, reciprocal connections. Basically, this is about moving beyond control or validation-seeking behaviors into real, mutual relationships where others are seen as whole and separate people. And don't worry, we're going to get into this in detail, so all of this will become clear as we go into the interview. If this discussion resonates with you and you want to hear more, stay tuned. I'll be sharing another clip real soon. But if you're eager to dive into the full conversation right now, you can head over to Valerie's podcast. I'll include the link in the show notes below. After listening to this clip, as always, if you have any questions for me, please feel free to reach out. I would love to hear from you. Okay, I hope you enjoy this clip.
Let's continue really just bottom lining what are these painful cycles, because like it may be a case study or an example so that people can identify themselves. And then we can talk about how have you helped narcissists to recognize.
Okay.
I did listen to a story in your podcast, for example, where you talk about how you worked with a narcissist and even just getting him to recognize that he was using you as kind of like an encyclopedia.
Oh,
it was like
okay, yes.
Shameful for him to even realize, but once you helped him realize that that's what he was doing, then he could be more self-aware that you're a person. And so, it's like, that's one of the things that I think is good to talk about. But first, let's bottom line, like, what's the consequences? Like, if I'm codependent and I share something that I need, all of a sudden they fly into a rage and then we're in a painful cycle. And why is that so difficult? And what does it mean that we're always beating our head against a wall, which is what people usually tell me?
Yeah, this is so interesting because the cycle, I think you're probably familiar with, and anybody who listens to social media looks at this sort of pattern that goes on with, they call it like love bombing. There's this idealized state, everything is blissful, and then comes the devaluing stage, and then the hoovering. And that's okay. I mean, it's general enough that most people can resonate with something like that. But the main thing I want to make clear, and you just did it, by the way, Valerie, and we did it a little bit earlier, but this is so important. It's worth repeating. Like, review is good. Someone doesn't go from like the loving, idealized stage to the devaluing just one day when they woke up and they decide to devalue you. But most people don't recognize this because they don't get really close to these people and follow the really subtle nuances of what happens. And to do that, you have to slow them down. You have to get them into a regulated state of mind. And 99% of the time, what you hear is there was a separation of some sort. Again, a separation can be anything like you just described. It could even just be a different opinion on something, believe it or not. It's as subtle as that.
Right.
So it could be the end of a honeymoon weekend where they're both coming home and you pick up a phone call or you respond to a text when you're in the car and they're like, oh, you're going right back. You're leaving me. You know, we're still on vacation. I don't. But you see, these things are very subtle, but that's what typically leads to the sort of the puncture in the blissful union that happens, which is what they need, right? Because that sort of disavows any kind of loss or separation. So now they're faced with a separation, which is intolerable. They don't know how to manage separations because they've been traumatized by this early in life, which we could talk about, like where this comes from. I don't know if we want to go into that, but this is what causes it, is early trauma that has not yet been worked through. So they don't learn how to tolerate separation aside from trying to control you, right? Or control the other person or withdrawing. You know, that's the block that goes up that you and I mentioned a little bit earlier. That's the whole grandiose structure, which is great for dealing with loss because now, again, nothing matters. There's a dismissive attitude. And that's why it's a cycle, because what happens is there's no real working through of a loss. There's usually not even a recognition of it because they're so busy blaming one another in these relationships.
Right.
And then things just go back seemingly to being okay, but they don't understand why things went off the rails in the first place or why things are better now. It's just like things are just better when we're talking again. And then before you know it, things are great and wonderful. And that's when they're in trouble, because when things are great and wonderful, like we said before, that's a red flag.
Well, right. It's things are great and wonderful when we're meeting all their needs and
Exactly.
bending over backwards to proactively guess what they need and attune to them and always be there for them.
And it's wonderful for you too, but just so you know, that's the shared fantasy. It's wonderful for you too when you're meeting their needs. Why? Because it's like you're mothering, you're being there for somebody in a way that's a narcissistic boost for you too, because it feels really good to, I don't know, be there, cook a meal, be so responsive, and then be recognized. You see, that's what you get back is the recognition and appreciation. The thing that you think that you really need, that's going to make everything better in you. But of course it doesn't, because that's not what you really need.
Right, exactly. And that's, yeah, we'll talk about more about that with the codependence, because what we really need is that deep emotional connection.
Exactly. Yes.
But if we're either a narcissist or codependent, we don't recognize that need.
Yep.
So let's talk about then what are the ways that they're capable of changing, because I'll talk about how to heal codependence in my interview, but you're more familiar with what are the ways that a narcissist can change. So that's really what I want to ask you about.
So I don't want to be overly schematic, but let's say there are 4 things that come to my mind with this question, okay? So the first thing is, when we think about change, like we have to ask ourselves, like, how do we define change? Like, what does change look like? So that's always, I think, a good place to start, because you always hear they don't change. And it's like, well, they do change, maybe not in a way that you're thinking. So let's start with that, because true change, what you and I are discussing now, not just like adjusting, you know, like we were just describing, like being there to meet somebody's needs after a fight. That's like making a quick adjustment.
Right.
You know, that's like a honeymoon phase. But true change requires deep work. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to be in psychoanalytic therapy, right? Like 4 times a week. Of course, that might be ideal, but not everybody could do that or is interested. But through listening to the work that you and I do, listening to our podcast, reading, studying this stuff, being open-minded, all of that is part of what I would call doing the emotional work, okay? So I'm just going to go over like the 4 that I think are most important criteria for change. First, they have to have the ability to recognize that there's a problem, right? In other words, not that it's just your problem, Valerie, or whoever, right? That it's not somebody, but that in some way, inadvertently, that they may have actually contributed to this problem, whatever the problem may be, whether it's a fight, an argument, right? So that's the first thing, is they have to have this ability, and that's no easy task because with the grandiose structure, the thing, that structure that I mentioned earlier, it does no wrong. You see, it's perfect. So they tend to externalize any problem. So everything good is in me, and usually everything bad, when things go bad, is in somebody else. So
Right.
that's a big
That's their
step.
belief. I mean, I just want to that
Yeah, tell me, say it again. I'm
saying,
sorry.
but that goes without saying, but I just want to hone in on it. Like that's their belief, but obviously
Yes.
not the truth. But that's how they think. They think there's nothing wrong with me. I could do no wrong. The problem is always with the other person. So what I'm hearing in this first characteristic
Hmm.
of knowing if they can change is, are they self-aware enough to take a little bit of responsibility? Like
Yes.
I'm taking
Exactly.
responsibility for the impact. Even if it's just 1%, I did something that was, because I don't even look at right versus wrong. I look at values judgments. It's like my action caused you pain.
Yes.
Can I
So funny you said 1%, right?
responsibility for that? Right.
I like that you said 1% because I literally hear this when I'm working with couples. And the husband may say to the wife, can you not take any responsibility at all? Like, is it 100% my responsibility all the time? It's always all my fault. Like, not even 1% is your fault. So it's funny you mention that because people think in this way, like, how is it possible that 100% of the time it's always my problem in something that I did? So that's a good place to start. When thinking of is change possible, can they take even 1% of the responsibility for something that went wrong, right? And then along with that is if they can, let's say they take some percentage, the next step is can they seriously take your feelings into consideration? Like, let's say, for example, a lot of times people come to me after there's an affair in the relationship. So now they have to begin a process of developing trust again. And let's just say it's the guy who cheats on the wife. He's going out with his friends and she's getting anxious. Can he say something like, listen, no problem. I'm going out with my friends, but I'll check in with you through the night. I'll call you or I'll send you pictures. It sounds like it's controlling. And some people can't do this because they're like, oh, now she's just trying to control me, right? It's kind of like, can I look at your phone? In other words, can you turn over your phone to somebody for them to look at as you're trying to repair the damage? Now, if you have genuine concern, right? If you can acknowledge and take responsibility for somebody else's feelings, which is really, really a big step. It's hard, but this is part of what you would see if they're on their way to change. They say, take my phone. No, no worries. I have nothing to hide. And if that's going to make you feel better, I want you to feel better. I want you to begin to trust me. So take my phone. So that's one of the criteria. Okay. So
Right.
this,
Yeah. And
yeah,
I mean, I want to pause you there just because,
please.
I mean, first of all, I just want to caveat what I said. Obviously, I do believe in right and wrong and some,
Mhm.
right? But what I'm talking about in relationship dynamics, it's more about feelings and needs and values judgments rather than moralistic judgments. So I just wanted to caveat
Yes.
that. But what
Okay.
you just said, I think is really important. And I wanted to kind of hone in on it that if a narcissist is capable of recognizing that the other person's feeling is separate and
Hmm.
caring, because I'm going to talk about this more in my interview, that true interdependence, it doesn't mean that if the other person says give me your, I want to be able to look at your phone, that the person would be like yes right away. It's a collaboration. It's
Hmm.
I recognize that. What would that provide for you? You need to feel safe. I want to help you to feel safe. This is one strategy. There might be other strategies besides looking at my phone, but they're
That's right.
going to be willing to consider what the other person needs to feel safe rather than just having this ideal fantasy of you should just feel safe because that's your job.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. I like the word collaboration too. That's such an important piece of it because you may not be comfortable handing over your phone, but you're willing to talk to your significant other and say, this is not what works for me. But let's not give up on this because I still want you to feel comfortable. What else can I do to prove, that I'm not still whatever
Right. And
looking
they
for
would be
positive?
able
Yeah.
to get vulnerable about why. Like it's a nice idea to look at my phone, but I'm uncomfortable with it because it's my work phone. And,
Mm,
my colleagues, I need to be on call all the time. And, I might
yes.
miss something. But how about you look at my computer or whatever? You know what I mean? Like they're going to be more willing to work with you to find strategies that work with both of you rather than my way or the highway.
Yes. And by the way, just so you know, this is like, if we call it criteria, like number two, right? The capacity for emotional depth, right? Before I mention that they tend to be shallow in their relationships. But what you're describing now is that they're able to tolerate painful feelings, either in themselves, they have their own reasons why they may not be able to do whatever it is, shame, humiliation, insecurity, whatever reason, but also the emotions of somebody else, that there really is a need in this other person and that's okay because they want to build trust with them. So now this all requires tolerating painful feelings both within yourself and within somebody else. And that's not easy again, because it's much easier just to go back to a word we used earlier, the love bombing, right? The idealized relationship where, no, you don't need to look at my phone. Everything is great. We're going out. Aren't you having fun with me? Don't you trust me? We just went to this party or whatever. I mean, you could fill in the blank, but
Right.
that's all the love bombing, all of that. That's part of, if they go back to that, or they go into a rage, by the way, right? The corollary of love bombing, but still the same thing. It takes them out of the experience of the moment and being with the other person. And
Right.
that's not a good sign, right? That they're really genuinely interested in change. Yeah.
Right. No, exactly. And that's hard. That's why I think if you're recognizing that you might have some of these 13 characteristics, it's easy to Google what they are, that it can be really hard to change on your own. That's why Dr. Mazzella focuses on working with people who have personality disorders, because when we start to, like I said, I'm still healing my own codependence, which is overlapping healing because codependents don't know how to give empathy to their deeper emotions either. They're also
Mhm.
caught in the fantasy. So when we start to learn how to give ourselves empathy and compassion for our own feelings, usually what comes up is so much grief from our childhood that from coming from the wounding that we didn't get that need met when we actually needed it the most when we were little. And so if that comes up and you don't know how to handle it, it is important to work with a professional.
Mm-hmm. One advantage, if you could do this, and this is, I guess, another criteria now that you mentioned it, is the effort has to be consistent and sustained over time. Because if they have these traits, and even if it's like full blown, it's a personality disorder, that implies that it's deeply ingrained in their personality, and it affects many different areas of life. So change doesn't happen overnight, and that's something else that needs to be considered. Because sometimes I get these calls, and people want to change, and they're very committed. And then I ask them, "What do you think is going to be necessary? Like, how long do you think you'll be talking to me?" And they're like, "I don't know, maybe a couple of months." And I say, I think maybe you'll get some relief in a couple of months, but that's like barely scratching the surface. So that's the other thing. There's not just that they're motivated to change, but that there has to be, I guess, a willingness for the consistency of doing the work. And whatever the work is, whether it's with a trained, therapist or with you, Valerie, but that it has to be consistent and done over time. And the grandiose sense of self or the vulnerability, the things I mentioned earlier, are all what we call structures that develop in the mind. The illusion that I'm perfect, you can imagine like how powerful that is.
Mhm.
So that stuff takes time to undo. Structures are a process with a slow rate of change, which not everybody can tolerate, but usually after 6 months of good treatment, 6 to 9 months, you really start to see pretty significant changes, enough that they start to feel, or their relationships, they may not start to feel better, by the way, because they're losing that grandiose structure, which is what
Right.
held them together. So that's really important to note. It's not like therapy or doing this work is going to be easy, because then you're faced with confronting a painful reality, right?
Right.
Or painful feelings, like you just mentioned, deep from childhood that you may not have ever dealt with before. So that's another criteria, which is the sustained work. Yeah.
Right. No, that makes sense. So like, let's go over these 4 criteria again, the taking responsibility, even if it's just 1%.
Yes.
And
1%. I like that.
meaning even just acknowledging like this other person has separate emotions and separate thoughts and separate beliefs, and that's okay.
That's the emotional depth. Yep. So that's
Right.
that's what we call emotional depth, right? I have deeper feelings and somebody else has deeper feelings. Yes.
Right. No, exactly. And that they're able to recognize the other person as separate, right? That's kind of like, and have a little bit of empathy for the other person's feelings. That's the second thing you mentioned. And then the fourth is the capability of being able to do sustained work over time.
Yes.
Just because of me being difficult to find the words, but
no, it's just sustained. That's it. You got the word. It's just the continuity of keeping after this, recognizing, as painful as it is, that change doesn't happen quickly. When the more of these traits that you have, right, the longer it's going to take. Or for someone who's in this kind of relationship, right, the longer it's going to take to mourn and get over that. Yeah.
No, exactly. It's not a simple, personality disorders are not a simple thing to grapple with.
Yep.
It is, the entire personality structure is based on these limiting beliefs and masks, and it's painful to remove them, and the person doesn't feel better as they're being removed.
Because they're adaptive, this is what they learn. This is, believe it or not, this is how they survived. And if you think about it this way, you mentioned this earlier as well, about having compassion for these people. And one way to have compassion is to understand that they needed to survive. Everybody needs to feel recognized or validated to survive. If I could digress just for one moment, you may have seen this research experiment. It's on YouTube. It's so fascinating. It's called the still face experiment. And they have children, infants, with their caregiver. And the researcher instructs the caregiver just to give the developing child a still face. So they videotape this. And what they show is the caregiver playing with the child. The child is happy, smiling, cooing, pointing. And then they put a still face on, which is just like having a parent who's not emotionally available, right? Valerie Greene calls this the dead mother, right? There's a whole psychoanalytic concept for this, but it's someone who's not affectively alive and attuned to you. Within seconds, Valerie, maybe you've seen this, within seconds, you could see the discomfort on the infant's face. They try to re-engage their parent, but the parent, stays with the still face. They start banging on the table, right? That's like your angry narcissist, by the way. Then they look away. So there's the dismissiveness, like, I don't need you. And slowly, within 90 seconds, right? Like maybe 60 to 90 seconds, you could see them completely collapse. It's actually heartbreaking to watch it. But if you think of someone who's completely collapsing, how important then the whole grandiose narcissistic need for affirmation and recognition becomes. It really was adaptive. So yeah, it's defensive, it's true. And I know it's maladaptive when it comes to relationships, but it was adaptive in learning to survive. And that's what they know. And that's all they know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I appreciate you saying that because, and when I say I have compassion, that's why, because as a coach, coaching is more about teaching skills and helping just do the cognitive work and teaching skills. I also do some healing, so it's therapy is deeper in the healing perspective. But regardless, like, I know what it takes to change, and I have a lot of compassion for how challenging it is for somebody who has these personality structures. Not that that means that I would cross my own boundaries or tolerate behavior that doesn't work for me just because I have compassion. But I think that it's important to be able to have compassion enough to recognize, I'm curious, does the person I know have these 4 characteristics that you mentioned that allow change to happen?
Right.
And if you notice that they do, the question is, how might you be able to influence them to seek help?
Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.